Question number 4. Do the Gospels contain eyewitness tradition?
When I was a Bible-believing evangelical Christian, attending Moody Bible Institute, before I began my serious scholarship on the New Testament, before I began to read it in Greek, and before I saw what serious scholars of the world had to say about it, I was absolutely convinced that the Gospels not only contained eyewitness tradition, but that they were written by two eyewitnesses, Matthew and John, and by two people who were close companions to people who were eyewitnesses, Mark and Luke. Intense research has a way of changing your mind about things. But I don't want you to think that this is a reason for you not to use your brain. Even if you are the most hardcore, Bible-believing evangelical on the planet, you surely think that God gave you a brain. Use your brain. Craig and I will agree on this. God gave you a brain to think with. Apply reason. That's why God made you a human being instead of a slug. Don't be afraid of using your intelligence to find out the truth. The truth may not be what you were taught, but if it's true, you should believe it, not run from it. As I studied more and more using my intelligence as an evangelical, but also praying about it, I became convinced that the New Testament Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew eyewitnesses. The first point to make is the rather obvious one that the Gospels don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They are all anonymous. The titles in your Gospels, the Gospel according to Matthew and so forth, were added by later editors. They were not put there by the original authors. Second point, none of the Gospels claims to be written by the person whose name it bears. They don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and they don't claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are later traditions that were added to the Gospels. These traditions do not start appearing for about 100 years. Some people think that there is an early church father named Papias who attests to the witness of Mark and Matthew, but in fact there are very solid reasons for thinking that Papias, who lived around the year 120 to 140, is not referring to our Mark or our Matthew. The first time anybody refers to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by name is Irenaeus in the year 180, 100 years after these books were written.
Hello folks, so we have Bart Ehrmon here shouting the odds saying that Papias, he said that they will have solid reasons to believe that the Papias was not talking about our Mark and our Matthew. But guess what folks, he decides not to give you those solid reasons because he's fabricating it up in his mind. Okay, if he had solid reasons, then he would be firing them at the audience. You and I know it. So Papias can be trusted. Of course he can. Among many, nearly all scholars, I would say. First of all, I want to start off by saying this, that strictly speaking, the Gospels are anonymous. But the uniform testimony of the early church was that Matthew, also known as Levi, one of the 12 disciples, was the author of the first gospel in the New Testament, and that Mark, a companion of Peter, was the author of the gospel that we call Mark, and that Luke, also known as Paul's beloved physician, was the author of both the Acts of the Apostles and the Gospel of Luke. There are no known competitors for these three gospels. Remember that, there are no known competitors for these three gospels. Now, what specific evidence do we have that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John wrote the Gospels? Well, we will go to our trusted Papias. So let's start. The testimony of a Christian writer named Papias, dated about 125 AD, refers to John the Apostle and John the Elder. And it's not clear from the context whether he's talking about one person or from two perspectives or two different people. But granted that exception, the rest of the early testimony is unanimous in that it was John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee, who wrote the Gospel. Now, again, The oldest and probably most significant testimony comes from Papias, who says that Mark had carefully and accurately recorded Peter's eyewitness observations. In fact, he said Mark made no mistake at all and did not include any false statement. Papias said that Matthew also preserved the teachings of Jesus also. And Irenaeus, writing about 180 AD, confirmed the traditional authorship of the Gospels. Irenaeus wrote, Matthew published his own Gospel among the Hebrews in their own tongue when Paul and Peter were preaching the Gospel in Rome and founding the church there. After their departure, Mark himself handed down to us the substance of Peter's preaching. Luke set down in the Gospel also preached by his teacher, and that John, the disciple John, who also leaned upon the Lord's breast, published his own Gospel while living at Ephesus in Asia. Now the question lies, and it's this: would anyone have had a motivation to be achieved by saying that these people wrote the Gospels when they really didn't? Well, you got to remember, Mark and Luke weren't even among the 12 disciples. Matthew was, but as a former hated tax collector, he would have been the most infamous character next to Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus. Now contrast that with what happened when the fanciful apocryphal Gospels were written much later. People chose the names of well-known and exemplary figures to be their fictitious authors, like Philip, Peter, Mary, James. Those names carried a lot more weight than the names of Matthew, Mark and Luke. So to answer the question, there would not have been any reason to attribute authorship to these less known, respectful people if it weren't true. So there you go, folks. That's just my wee reply to Bart Ehrmon, who's shouting the odds, saying that we have solid reasons and just doesn't point them out. But I give you a wee bit of piece of information there, and I hope it helps. And God bless yous all. Thank you.